For centuries, the British royal family has stood as one of the most powerful dynasties on earth, their secrets buried beneath layers of ceremony and silence. Tonight, we uncover 99 dark truths they desperately tried to hide. Before we dive in, comment where in the world you are watching from and don't forget to click subscribe. Number 1. For all the grandeur that surrounded Queen Victoria, very few people know that behind the gilded corridors of Windsor and Osborne House, she carried a quiet dependency that her court worked carefully to conceal. After the sudden death of her beloved husband, Prince Albert, in December 1861, Victoria fell into a grief so consuming and so total that her physicians prescribed chloral hydrate, a powerful sedative commonly used in the Victorian era to manage severe insomnia and emotional distress. What began as a medical intervention deepened into something her household monitored with growing concern, as the Queen came to rely on its effects to navigate the weight of each passing day. Victoria also consumed laudanum regularly, an opium-based tincture that was entirely legal in the 19th century, but carried a significant risk of dependency with prolonged use. Her court understood the political delicacy of this situation and worked to ensure that her public appearances conveyed nothing but composure and authority. Number 2. The abdication of King Edward VIII in December 1936 is one of the most romanticized episodes in all of royal history, most often recounted as a love story between a king and an American divorcee named Wallis Simpson. The real reasons behind Edward's removal from power are considerably darker and more politically charged than the official narrative ever acknowledged. British intelligence had quietly accumulated extensive evidence that both Edward and Wallis maintained close and potentially dangerous relationships with senior figures inside the Nazi regime. A visit to Germany in October 1937, just months after the abdication, included a meeting with Adolf Hitler at Berchtesgaden, during which Edward reportedly spoke in ways that deeply alarmed his former advisors. Documents declassified in subsequent decades revealed that Wallis in particular was believed to have passed sensitive information to German contacts during the years of her relationship with Edward while he was still on the throne. Number 3. Among the most quietly devastating secrets that the British royal family buried in the early 20th century is the story of Prince John, the youngest son of King George V and Queen Mary. Born in 1905, John was initially introduced to the public as a healthy royal child, but by the time he was around 4 years old, it became clear that he suffered from epilepsy, and what historians and medical professionals now believe may have been a neurodevelopmental condition consistent with autism. As his seizures grew more frequent and his behavior increasingly difficult to manage within the formal constraints of palace life, the institution made a decision that has haunted its reputation ever since. John was quietly removed from public view, separated from his siblings, and installed at Wood Farm on the Sandringham estate in Norfolk, with a small household of carers, led by his devoted nanny, known as Lalla Bill. He was essentially hidden, never again photographed alongside his family in official portraits, never mentioned in public statements. When Prince John died in January 1919 at the age of 13, following a particularly severe seizure, his mother, Queen Mary, wrote in her diary that it was a happy release. Number 4. In July 1917, King George V issued a royal proclamation that quietly, but fundamentally, altered one of the most visible symbols of his family's identity. The British royal family, tracing its recent lineage through the House of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, had carried a name that was unmistakably German in origin, an inheritance from Prince Albert, the beloved consort of Queen Victoria. With Britain locked in the most devastating conflict in its history against Germany, and anti-German sentiment running at a fever pitch throughout the empire, including in Australia, where the war had claimed tens of thousands of young lives at Gallipoli and on the Western Front, the palace understood that the optics of a German-named royal house were politically untenable. The name Windsor was chosen deliberately, taken from the famous castle, and the proclamation was issued with the kind of quiet efficiency the palace had already mastered. What was less openly discussed at the time was the extent to which the family's German roots ran far deeper than a surname. The Windsors were, by blood and lineage, a deeply German family. Number 5. The death of King George V on January 20th, 1936, has carried a quiet and disturbing secret for nearly 90 years, one that only became publicly known when the private diaries of the royal physician Lord Dawson of Penn were released to historians decades after the fact. What those diaries revealed was deeply unsettling. George V had been declining for several days before his death, his condition serious but not necessarily immediately fatal on the night he died. Lord Dawson wrote with clinical precision that he had injected the king with a lethal combination of morphine and cocaine in the hours before midnight, a decision made not primarily for the relief of George's suffering, but to ensure that the announcement of the king's death would appear in the morning editions of the Times of London, rather than in the less distinguished evening papers. In other words, the King of England was euthanized partly to manage a press deadline. Lord Dawson had even telephoned the Times earlier that evening to ask them to hold their front page. George was not conscious to consent to any such intervention, and Queen Mary and the Prince of Wales were present at Sandringham when the decision was carried out. Number 6. In the summer of 1933, a photograph was taken at Balmoral Castle that the British royal family spent many decades attempting to keep from public view, and which, when it eventually surfaced in the archives of a British newspaper, caused considerable discomfort for an institution already sensitive about its wartime associations. The image showed a young Princess Elizabeth, then a child of approximately 7 years old, alongside her mother, her uncle, the Prince of Wales, who would later briefly become Edward VIII, and other family members gathered in the gardens. In the photograph, several of the adults, including the future Edward VIII and the woman who would become the Queen Mother, appear to be raising their arms in what resembles a Nazi salute. Buckingham Palace acknowledged the photograph when it was published by The Sun in 2015 and issued a statement noting that the image dated from a period before the full nature of the Nazi regime was widely understood, and that any gesture made by a young child carried no political significance. But historians noted with some frustration that the photograph had not surfaced spontaneously. Number 7. The connection between the Duke of Windsor and the Nazi regime extended far beyond a single photograph or a famous visit to Germany. Declassified intelligence documents, gradually released over several decades by British and American governments, paint a picture considerably more alarming than anything acknowledged in official accounts. The Marburg Files, a collection of German Foreign Ministry documents captured by Allied forces at the end of World War II and subsequently classified for many years at Winston Churchill's specific personal request, contained detailed evidence of communications between the Duke of Windsor and German intelligence officials. Among the claims in those documents was the suggestion that Edward had conveyed sensitive information about Allied military positions to German contacts, that he had expressed a willingness to serve as a cooperative figurehead, King of Britain in the event of a successful German invasion, and that German planners genuinely considered him a useful strategic asset. Number 8. In the spring of 1917, as revolution consumed Russia and the Romanov family found themselves under house arrest following Tsar Nicholas II's abdication, a quiet and desperate appeal was made to King George V of Britain. The Tsar and the King were first cousins, their resemblance to one another so striking that photographs of them together are sometimes difficult to distinguish. The British government initially supported the idea of offering the Romanov family asylum, and the matter was raised seriously at the highest levels of government. But King George V, after initially agreeing to the proposal, privately reversed his position. His private secretary, Lord Stamfordham, sent a letter to the Foreign Office, making clear that the king felt extending an invitation to the Romanovs would be politically inadvisable, given the strength of anti-Tsarist feeling in Britain and the risk of inflaming public opinion at a time when the country's own political stability was under strain. Whether George acted primarily from political calculation or personal cowardice remains a matter of debate among historians. What followed is history. Number 9. Queen Mary of Teck, the wife of King George V and grandmother of Queen Elizabeth II, was by all accounts a woman of formidable dignity, extraordinary composure, and a passion for beautiful objects that those in court circles described in careful, whispered terms. Her passion for collecting, however, had a dark and rather uncomfortable edge that aristocratic families across Britain understood very well. Queen Mary had a habit of admiring objects in the homes of her hosts with a pointed and sustained intensity that made experienced householders deeply uneasy. If the Queen admired something, it was understood throughout the upper reaches of British society that the polite and expected response was to offer it to her as a gift before she departed. Many of these gifts were not offered out of genuine generosity. Accounts from aristocratic families describe the quiet ritual of watching Queen Mary move through a room, expressing admiration for specific pieces, and the implicit social pressure to present those items to the Queen, rather than endure the awkwardness of a refusal. Objects given in this manner were rarely returned. Number 10. King Edward VII, who reigned from 1901 until his death in 1910, was widely understood among those who moved in court circles to be one of the most sexually active monarchs in British history, his affairs numerous and his appetite for companionship extending well beyond his marriage to the long-suffering Queen Alexandra. While still serving as Prince of Wales, Edward conducted well-documented relationships with figures including the actress Lily Langtry, the socialite Daisy Greville, Countess of Warwick, and Alice Keppel, whose great-granddaughter Camilla would one day marry Edward's great-great-grandson, Charles III. The question of illegitimate children is difficult to establish with certainty, as the historical evidence is scattered and partially obscured, but several historians have argued, with conviction, that Edward fathered children beyond his official family. The Countess of Warwick was among those around whom such speculation most persistently gathered. Court circles of the era operated on a principle of deliberate collective silence on such matters, and Edward's marriage to Alexandra was in many respects a formal arrangement that both parties navigated according to the conventions of the time. Number 11. One of the more peculiar traditions maintained at the Sandringham estate in Norfolk for many decades was the practice of keeping all clocks set exactly 30 minutes ahead of Greenwich Mean Time, a custom introduced by King Edward VII and faithfully maintained by his son, George V. Known informally as Sandringham time, the arrangement meant that everyone on the estate operated half an hour ahead of the rest of the country, an eccentricity tolerated partly because both kings were deeply devoted to Sandringham as their preferred private residence, and partly because challenging such arrangements in the presence of monarchs was simply not done. The ostensible justification was practical. Setting the clocks forward allowed more usable daylight hours for the shooting parties and outdoor pursuits that both kings greatly enjoyed during the short Norfolk winter days. What this tradition reveals, beyond its surface strangeness, is something more significant about the world within which the British royal family operated. The palace and its estates existed, in certain fundamental respects, outside the rhythms, rules, and conventions that governed everyone else's lives. Number 12. The true extent of the British royal family's personal wealth has never been fully disclosed to the public, and the mechanisms by which that wealth is held, protected, and transferred between generations are deliberately obscured behind layers of legal complexity that have never been properly scrutinized in open court or public inquiry. The sovereign grant, which replaced the civil list in 2012, represents the primary public mechanism through which the monarch receives state funding amounting to a fixed percentage of the Crown Estate's annual profits. But this public figure represents only a fraction of the complete financial picture. The Duchy of Lancaster, a private estate held personally by the monarch and entirely separate from public funding, generates tens of millions of pounds annually in rents and commercial income. The Duchy of Cornwall, inherited automatically by the heir to the throne, operates on a similar basis. The Royal Art Collection, one of the largest and most valuable private collections anywhere in the world, is technically held in trust for the nation, but is not subject to the same transparency requirements as other publicly held assets. Number 13. The Koh-i-Noor diamond, one of the most famous and one of the largest cut diamonds in the world, sits at the center of the crown worn by queen consorts at British coronations, and its presence there is a source of ongoing controversy that the palace has consistently declined to address with any meaningful transparency. The diamond's history is one of conquest, coercion, and disputed ownership that stretches back centuries. It passed them through the hands of various Mughal emperors, Persian conquerors, and Afghan rulers before ending up in the possession of the young Maharaja Duleep Singh, who was pressured into ceding it to the British East India Company and ultimately to Queen Victoria, following the annexation of the Punjab in 1849. Duleep Singh, who had been separated from his mother and effectively raised as a ward of the British Empire, later described the circumstances under which the diamond changed hands as anything but voluntary. India, Pakistan, Iran, and Afghanistan have all, at various times, formally requested the return of the stone. Number 14. The connection between the British royal family and the transatlantic slave trade is one that the institution has been slow to acknowledge and even slower to examine with any degree of genuine honesty. The British Crown was directly involved in the establishment and regulation of the slave trade through royal charters granted to trading companies, beginning with the Royal Adventurers into Africa in the 17th century, which was reorganized into the Royal African Company in 1672 under the direct patronage of King Charles II. The Royal African Company held a monopoly on the British slave trade for several years and transported more enslaved Africans to the Americas than any other single institution in the history of the transatlantic trade. The profits from this enterprise flowed upward through the colonial economy and enriched the crown and the aristocracy in ways that shaped British wealth and power for generations. Several of the grand estates and palaces that the royal family continues to occupy were built or improved using wealth that traced directly back to the labor of enslaved people. Number 15. The Commonwealth of Nations, often presented as a voluntary association of equal member states, bound together by shared values and a history of cooperation, is a structure whose origins in empire are considerably less benign than the official promotional material tends to suggest. When the British Empire began its long, reluctant retreat from formal colonialism in the years following World War II, the Commonwealth was developed in part as a mechanism for maintaining British influence over newly independent nations that might otherwise have looked elsewhere for alliances and trading partners. The organization operates without a binding charter, without enforceable human rights standards, and without any mechanism for holding member states or the institution itself accountable. Former colonies, including Australia and many nations across Africa and Asia, were effectively invited to remain within a British-centered structure at a moment when their negotiating power was limited and their new governments were fragile. Number 16. On November 11th, 1975, Australians awoke to news that shook the constitutional foundations of their country in ways that have never fully been resolved. The Governor-General of Australia, Sir John Kerr, had dismissed the elected Prime Minister Gough Whitlam, who had the support of the House of Representatives, in a constitutional manoeuvre that remains the most controversial event in modern Australian political history. What has emerged through decades of historical research and the gradual release of previously classified documents is that the palace was far more involved in the events surrounding the dismissal than was publicly acknowledged at the time. Kerr had been in communication with the Queen's private secretary, Sir Martin Charteris, in the period leading up to his decision, and the nature and content of those communications has been a matter of intense historical dispute. The palace consistently maintained that the Queen was not consulted about and did not approve the dismissal in advance, and that constitutional convention required her to remain at arm's length from such decisions. Number 17. The relationship between the British Crown and the forced removal of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from their families, a policy now known as the Stolen Generation, is a chapter of Australian history that implicates the Crown at every level of the colonial and post-colonial system. The policies that authorised the removal of children were enacted under Australian law during a period when the British monarch was the constitutional head of the Australian Commonwealth, when governors appointed by and ultimately accountable to the Crown administered the relevant legislation, and when the entire framework of the Australian state drew its legal authority from the Crown. Aboriginal children were taken from their families under policies operating in various forms from the late 19th century through to the 1970s, with the stated goals including the assimilation of Aboriginal people into white Australian society and, in the language of some of the most extreme policy documents, the biological absorption of Aboriginal bloodlines into the white population over generations. The long-term effects on Aboriginal communities have been catastrophic in ways that continue to manifest across generations. Number 18. The British Crown's land holdings in Australia are a subject that rarely surfaces in mainstream public discussions about the monarchy, but they form a significant and under-examined part of the story of how the colonial settlement of this continent was organised, justified, and maintained. The legal doctrine of terra nullius, the fiction that Australia was unoccupied land at the time of British settlement, was the mechanism through which the Crown claimed sovereignty over the entire continent and all its resources in 1788. This claim was made in the name of King George III, and the legal chain of title flowing from that original Crown claim forms the basis of land law in Australia to this day. While the High Court's Mabo decision in 1992 overturned the legal fiction of terra nullius and recognised that the prior rights of Indigenous Australians, the underlying framework of Crown sovereignty was not dismantled. The Crown, through the various Australian state and territory governments, still technically holds ultimate title over land that has not been transferred to private ownership or recognised under native title legislation. Number 19. The palace's correspondence with Sir John Kerr in the period leading up to the 1975 dismissal of Prime Minister Gough Whitlam has been the subject of a decades-long legal and historical dispute that reached its most dramatic point in 2020 when the Australian National Archives released a collection of previously classified letters between Kerr and the Queen's private secretary, Sir Martin Charteris. The release, following years of legal action by historian Jenny Hocking, revealed a picture of communication and implied understanding between the Governor-General and the Palace that was considerably more substantive than the official position had ever suggested. The letters showed that Kerr had been in contact with Charteris as early as October 1975, weeks before the dismissal, and that the communication was of a nature that implied Kerr was operating with at least the passive awareness, if not the tacit approval, of the Palace. What the letters did not contain was an explicit instruction or an explicit endorsement, which allowed the Palace to maintain its position that the Queen was constitutionally insulated from the decision. Number 20. Lord Louis Mountbatten, the last Viceroy of India, Supreme Allied Commander, Southeast Asia, and the man who served as a mentor and father figure to both Prince Charles and his father, Prince Philip, was by every official account one of the most brilliant and decorated British figures of the 20th century. The darker layers of his life have been more carefully managed. In the years following his death, when an IRA bomb killed him on his boat off the coast of County Sligo in August 1979, allegations began to emerge from various sources suggesting that Mountbatten had used his position and his access to vulnerable young people in ways that amounted to serious sexual abuse. A number of individuals came forward over subsequent decades with accounts of encounters at his various residences, including Classiebawn Castle in Ireland and Broadlands in Hampshire. These allegations were assessed by multiple journalists and investigators, and the question of what British intelligence knew and when has never been satisfactorily answered. Number 21. Princess Margaret's relationship with Group Captain Peter Townsend remains one of the most humanly poignant episodes in post-war British royal history. A story of genuine love constrained and ultimately destroyed by an institution that valued its own image and its relationship with the Church of England far above the happiness of one of its own. Townsend, a distinguished wartime pilot who had served on the royal household staff, was a divorced man with 2 children when his relationship with the younger princess became apparent in the early 1950s. The timing was acutely uncomfortable for the palace. The new Queen Elizabeth II was barely settled on the throne following the death of her father, and the institution was still carrying the memory of Edward VIII's abdication, triggered in part by his relationship with a divorced woman less than 20 years earlier. Margaret was in love with Townsend and genuinely wished to marry him. The mechanisms deployed against that possibility were extensive. Church of England doctrine at the time held that the remarriage of divorced people was contrary to God's law. Number 22. The relationship between the British royal family and the institution of Freemasonry runs deep and is considerably more extensive than either organisation tends to publicise. King Edward VII was a Freemason, having been initiated into the craft in 1868, and during his time as Prince of Wales, he served as Grand Master of the United Grand Lodge of England, the governing body of English Freemasonry. George VI was also a Freemason, and Prince Philip was initiated into the Navy Lodge in 1952. The Duke of Kent, a cousin of the Queen, has served as Grand Master of the United Grand Lodge of England since 1967, making the royal family's formal institutional connection to Freemasonry one of the longest continuously held in the world. What makes this connection more than a matter of historical curiosity is the question of what practical influence it represents. Number 23. The crown jewels, displayed at the Tower of London and viewed by millions of tourists every year as symbols of British heritage and royal continuity, are themselves the product of a history that is considerably more complicated than the display cabinets tend to suggest. The collection, as it exists today, was substantially assembled through conquest, colonial acquisition, and coercion over centuries of imperial expansion. The Cullinan diamond, the largest gem-quality rough diamond ever found, was discovered in South Africa in 1905 and presented to King Edward VII in what was framed as a gift from the Transvaal government, though historians have noted the political context of that gift. Given the recent Boer War and the awkward dynamics of a newly subordinated colonial government making a presentation to the sovereign power. The Black Prince's ruby, one of the most prominently displayed stones in the imperial state crown, is in fact a large red spinel rather than a ruby, acquired in the 14th century through circumstances involving considerable violence. Several items in the collection were seized from dethroned monarchs or obtained during military campaigns. Number 24. The Tower of London, now one of Britain's most visited tourist attractions, served for centuries as a place of imprisonment, torture, and execution, whose history the current presentation tends to soften considerably. The institution of the Crown used the tower systematically to eliminate political rivals, silenced dissent, and managed the succession in ways that were sometimes indistinguishable from state-sanctioned murder. Among those imprisoned and executed within its walls were two queens of England, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, both wives of Henry VIII, as well as Lady Jane Grey, who reigned for 9 days before being imprisoned and beheaded at the age of 16 or 17. The two young princes in the Tower, Edward V and his younger brother Richard, disappeared within the Tower in 1483, under circumstances that have never been fully explained and which most historians attribute to the actions of Richard III. Sir Thomas More, Sir Walter Raleigh, and hundreds of others of varying degrees of historical prominence spent time imprisoned in the Tower before meeting ends that the Crown found convenient. Number 25. The Order of the Garter, the oldest and most senior order of chivalry in England, was founded by King Edward III in 1348 and remains the personal gift of the sovereign to this day, awarded to individuals of the monarch's choosing without any requirement for formal recommendation from government. The order's membership, capped at 24 knights companion beyond senior royals, has included monarchs, senior aristocrats, and in more recent times, a selection of public figures chosen for their service to the nation. What is less well known is that the order's membership and processes are subject to almost no external oversight, and its internal rituals, conducted in the Chapel of St. George at Windsor Castle, have remained essentially unchanged for centuries. The order's motto, Honi soit qui mal y pense, meaning shame on whoever thinks evil of it, was reportedly uttered by Edward III himself when he picked up a garter dropped by a noblewoman at a court ball, though historians have long suspected this founding story was invented long after the fact. Number 26. On the afternoon of March 20th, 1974, a car carrying Princess Anne and her husband, Captain Mark Phillips, was stopped on the Mall in central London by a man named Ian Ball, who attempted to kidnap the princess at gunpoint, intending to hold her for a ransom of £3 million. What followed was a chaotic confrontation in which 4 people were shot, including Anne's bodyguard, her chauffeur, a passing police officer, and a journalist who attempted to intervene. Anne herself was remarkably composed throughout the ordeal, later recounting that she had argued with her attacker and refused to leave the car, telling him that she did not want to go. Ball was eventually overpowered and arrested. What was kept from public discussion in the years that followed was the extent to which the security failures surrounding the incident revealed serious gaps in the protection of senior royals at that time, and the degree to which those failures might have implicated broader questions about the organization of royal protection. The investigation also turned up details about Ball's mental state and the specific nature of his planning that were considered too sensitive for full public release. Number 27. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, beloved by the British public as the indefatigable matriarch of the royal family and celebrated for her apparent wartime solidarity with Londoners during the Blitz, carried behind her warmly cultivated public image a financial habit that caused considerable private alarm within palace circles. The Queen Mother had a weakness for gambling, and her debts accumulated over decades to figures that required careful and discreet management. Her love of horse racing was well known and considered charming by those who reported on it, but the private accounts of her gambling, which extended beyond racing to other forms of wagering, tell a different story. At the time of her death in 2002, at the age of 101, the Queen Mother's personal debts were reported to have reached approximately £7 million, a figure that required settlement from funds, including those from the Queen's personal resources. The precise nature of how those debts were managed and by whom has never been publicly disclosed. Number 28. The British royal family maintains an extensive system of private files, correspondence archives, and restricted documents that fall outside the normal provisions of freedom of information law and that are not subject to the same disclosure requirements as government records. The Royal Archives, held at Windsor Castle, contain material stretching back centuries, and while historians are occasionally granted access to specific collections under controlled conditions, a significant portion of the archive remains entirely closed to outside examination. The legal framework governing the Royal Archives exempts them from the Freedom of Information Act 2000 that applies to public bodies, meaning that unlike government departments and most public institutions, the palace can decline any request for access to its records without providing a justification that can be legally challenged. The practical effect is that vast quantities of material documenting the private views and actions of monarchs and senior royals across the past 2 centuries remain inaccessible and may remain so permanently. Number 29. The Duchy of Cornwall is one of the oldest and most financially significant private estates in Britain, established by King Edward III in 1337 as a means of providing income to the heir apparent to the throne, and it has operated ever since as a private estate whose revenues pass to whoever holds the title of Prince of Wales. The duchy encompasses approximately 135,000 acres of land spread across 23 counties, with the largest holdings concentrated in Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly, and it generates tens of millions of pounds annually in rental and commercial income. What distinguishes the duchy from an ordinary private estate in legal terms is its peculiar constitutional status. The duchy is not a government department, and its accounts are not subject to full independent audit in the way that public bodies are scrutinized. It does not pay corporation tax on its profits, a significant exemption that has attracted increasing criticism from tax justice advocates and parliamentary committees examining the broader question of how the royal family is funded. Number 30. Between 2004 and 2009, Prince Charles wrote a series of letters to government ministers and other officials that he subsequently fought, through his legal team, to prevent from being made public. Known informally as the Black Spider memos for the distinctive handwriting style in which they were composed, these letters covered a wide range of policy areas, including planning regulations, the future of the black-faced Hebridean sheep, the treatment of military veterans, and the regulation of alternative medicine. When the Guardian newspaper pursued their release through freedom of information, litigation that ultimately reached the Supreme Court and then required intervention from the Attorney General to suppress them, the case raised fundamental questions about the constitutional role of the heir to the throne. The British Constitutional Convention holds that the monarch and members of the royal family are politically neutral, that they do not lobby ministers on policy matters, and that their role is ceremonial and advisory rather than actively political. The Black Spider memos revealed that the heir to the throne had been conducting a sustained private lobbying campaign on a range of policy issues for years. Number 31. The marriage of Prince Charles and Lady Diana Spencer in July 1981 was presented to the world as a fairy tale. A young prince and a beautiful kindergarten assistant brought together in a ceremony watched by 750 million people around the globe. The private reality, as has been documented extensively by Diana herself and by those who observed the relationship from the inside, was something entirely different. Charles had been in a long-standing and deeply felt relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles before his engagement to Diana, and he had not ended that relationship before his marriage. Diana entered the marriage knowing, or quickly coming to understand, that she was not her husband's true emotional attachment. In a recording made for her biography by journalist Andrew Morton, Diana described the period around her wedding in terms of suffocating doubt, loneliness, and episodes of self-harm that she attributed directly to the stress of her situation. She described crying on the eve of her wedding and being told by her sisters that there was nothing to be done. Number 32. In the years before her death, Princess Diana expressed, in private letters and in conversations recorded by trusted friends, a belief that her life was in danger and that those who wished her harm were connected to people close to her own family. A letter that Diana had given to her butler, Paul Burrell, instructing him to open it in the event of her death, contained the statement that she believed a plan was being made to eliminate her in a car accident so that Charles would be free to remarry. The letter named a specific individual whom Diana believed was orchestrating the plan. After Diana's death, Burrell held the letter for a period before it became the subject of intense legal and public controversy, eventually being examined by Operation Paget, the Metropolitan Police inquiry into Diana's death, which concluded that the letter reflected Diana's state of mind and her fears, but did not constitute evidence of an actual conspiracy. Number 33. Diana, Princess of Wales, died in a car crash in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel in Paris in the early hours of August 31st, 1997. The official conclusion of both the French judicial investigation and the subsequent British Operation Paget inquiry was that the crash was caused by the grossly negligent driving of Henri Paul, the driver of the Mercedes, who was found to have been intoxicated at the time and who died in the same collision. That official conclusion has been contested ever since by a significant body of investigators, journalists, and members of the public who have pointed to a number of details in the case that they consider inadequately explained. The presence of a white Fiat Uno that made contact with the Mercedes before the crash and was never conclusively identified remains a notable gap in the investigation. The question of why it took almost 2 hours for Diana, who was alive immediately following the crash, to reach the hospital has been raised by medical professionals. The behavior of the security services in the period following the crash, specifically the question of what surveillance operations may have been active in Paris that night, has never been fully disclosed. Number 34. The British royal family's response to the death of Princess Diana in August 1997 became one of the most significant public relations crises in the institution's modern history, and the manner in which it was managed revealed the profound disconnect between the palace's instincts and the expectations of the British and Commonwealth public. In the immediate days following Diana's death, the royal family remained at Balmoral Castle in Scotland, maintaining their private mourning at a distance from the gathering crowds in London. The Queen did not return to the capital immediately. No flag flew at half-mast over Buckingham Palace, because the rule at the time held that the flag flew only when the sovereign was in residence and only at full mast. The crowds gathered outside the palace with their flowers, and their grief grew increasingly frustrated by what they perceived as royal coldness and institutional indifference. It fell to Prime Minister Tony Blair, who memorably described Diana as the people's princess, to capture and articulate the national mood while the palace appeared paralysed. Number 35. The story of Camilla Parker Bowles and her relationship with Prince Charles is one of the most carefully managed narratives in the entire history of the modern British monarchy. Charles and Camilla met in 1970 and formed an attachment that endured through his marriage to Diana, through Camilla's own marriage to Andrew Parker Bowles, and through the years of intense public hostility that followed Diana's death. For much of the 1990s, Camilla was the most publicly disliked woman in Britain, held responsible by a grieving public for the failure of what they had believed was a fairy tale marriage. The palace's strategy for rehabilitating her public image was methodical and long-term. She was introduced gradually, first as a friend, then as a companion, then as a partner, with each step carefully timed to allow public sentiment to adjust. The death of the Queen Mother in 2002 was privately considered by palace advisors to represent a significant obstacle removed, as the Queen Mother was known to be deeply opposed to any formal recognition of the relationship. Number 36. The relationship between Jimmy Savile, the British television presenter, later revealed to be one of the most prolific sexual predators in British broadcasting history, and the British royal family has been a source of sustained discomfort that the institution has managed with considerable care. Savile had extensive access to the royal family for decades, particularly to Prince Charles, with whom he maintained a friendship that included personal correspondence and social visits. He was a regular visitor to Highgrove, Charles's private residence, and photographs of Savile in royal company appeared regularly in the press over many years. After Savile's death in 2011 and the subsequent revelation of the extraordinary scale of his abuse, which investigators estimated may have involved hundreds of victims over several decades, the palace's approach was to acknowledge the friendship while minimizing its significance. The more troubling question is not about personal friendship, but about what those in positions of authority knew about Savile's conduct during his lifetime. Number 37. Prince Andrew, Duke of York, the second son of Queen Elizabeth II, stepped back from royal duties in November 2019, following an interview on the BBC's Newsnight programme in which he attempted to address his association with the convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein and the allegations of Virginia Giuffre that he had sexually assaulted her on 3 occasions, including when she was 17 years old. The interview, conducted with remarkable candour, about details that a more strategically minded communications team might have advised against sharing, was widely considered to have made the Duke's situation considerably worse rather than better. Andrew's friendship with Epstein was documented over many years, and he had visited Epstein's homes in New York, Palm Beach, and the Virgin Islands on multiple occasions after Epstein had already been convicted of procuring a minor for prostitution in 2008. In February 2022, Andrew settled civil litigation brought by Giuffre in the United States, reaching an out-of-court settlement for an undisclosed sum while making no admission of liability. Number 38. Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, was born into a royal family that was as thoroughly German as it was Greek in origin, and the history of his family during the 20th century is one that the palace spent considerable energy keeping at a comfortable distance from public attention. Philip's sisters, all 4 of them, married German princes, and 3 of those marriages connected his family to the Nazi hierarchy with a directness that was deeply awkward, given the war that followed. His sister Sophie married Prince Christoph of Hesse, who joined the Nazi Party and the SS, reaching the rank of Standartenführer. His sister Theodora married Berthold Margrave of Baden, and his sister Cecile married Georg Donatus, hereditary, Grand Duke of Hesse, who was also involved in Nazi Party activities. When Cecile and her family were killed in a plane crash in Belgium in 1937, Philip attended the funeral in Germany, surrounded by Nazi officials and family members in uniform. A photograph from that occasion showing the young Philip in the midst of an unmistakably fascist gathering. Number 39. Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, was a man whose private opinions on a remarkably wide range of subjects were considerably more forthright than the palace's communications team would have preferred. And over the course of 65 years, as the Queen's consort, he made a series of public remarks about race, national identity, indigenous people, and disability that caused diplomatic incidents of varying severity. During a 1995 visit to a factory in Edinburgh, he asked Scottish driving instructor Brian Sinclair how he had managed to keep the students awake. During a 1999 visit to Australia, he asked an Aboriginal elder whether Australians still threw spears at each other, a remark that caused particular offence in a country working through a deeply painful national conversation about its treatment of Aboriginal people. During a visit to China in 1986, he told British exchange students that if they stayed in China too long, they would go slit-eyed. The palace's standard response to these incidents was a combination of silent endurance and careful management of access. No formal apology was ever issued. Number 40. The Queen's annual Christmas broadcast, delivered each year and watched by millions across Britain, Australia, and the Commonwealth, is presented as a personal and spontaneous expression of the monarch's private thoughts and values. The reality behind each broadcast is considerably more carefully constructed. Each address is the product of weeks of drafting, consulting, reviewing, and refining involving the monarch's private office, senior palace officials, and occasionally Downing Street. The selection of themes, the choice of specific language, and the identification of which world events or personal reflections to include are all the result of institutional decision-making rather than personal inspiration. The Christmas broadcast has served at various points as a vehicle for subtle political messaging, for managing public perceptions during moments of royal difficulty, and for projecting particular images of the monarchy to audiences who might otherwise be forming less favourable impressions from the rest of the year's news coverage. Number 41. The British royal family exercises political influence through a variety of mechanisms that are not publicly acknowledged, not subject to democratic oversight, and largely invisible to the public in Britain, Australia, and the Commonwealth countries that share the same constitutional head of state. The most formalised of these mechanisms is the practice known as Queen's Consent, or now King's Consent, a constitutional requirement that the monarch must give approval before Parliament can debate bills that affect the Crown's interests, prerogatives, hereditary revenues, or the private property of the monarch. This consent is given in private before parliamentary debate, meaning that legislation affecting royal interests is reviewed and approved or modified by the palace before members of Parliament are even permitted to discuss it in public. A Guardian newspaper investigation in 2021 revealed that this consent mechanism had been used on hundreds of occasions over the preceding decades, and that, in a number of cases, the palace had requested changes to legislation before giving its consent. Number 42. Among the more unusual aspects of the relationship between Queen Elizabeth II and Margaret Thatcher, two of the most powerful British women of the 20th century, was the nature of the private weekly audiences that convention requires the Prime Minister to hold with the sovereign. These meetings are confidential by design, with no record kept and no disclosure permitted, giving both parties complete freedom to discuss matters that neither would be comfortable seeing reported. Accounts from those who were aware of the meeting's general character have consistently suggested that the relationship between the Queen and Thatcher was not warm, and that the political disagreements between the two women were substantive rather than merely stylistic. Sunday Times reporting in 1986 suggested that the Queen was deeply concerned about several of Thatcher's domestic policies, including the approach to the miners' strike of 1984 to 1985, and that she found the Prime Minister's confrontational approach divisive in ways she considered damaging to social cohesion. Number 43. The Profumo Affair of 1963, in which Secretary of State for War John Profumo was revealed to have been sharing a mistress with a Soviet naval attaché during the height of the Cold War, is typically told as a story about politics, espionage, and the hypocrisy of the British establishment. The connections between that scandal and the edges of royal life have been less thoroughly examined. The parties at which Profumo met Christine Keeler, the young woman at the centre of the affair, were held at Cliveden, the country estate of Lord Astor, and the social world within which those gatherings took place was one of overlapping, aristocratic, political, and royal circles. Stephen Ward, the osteopath and society figure, who occupied a central role in the network of relationships that eventually unravelled into the Profumo scandal, moved in circles with royal adjacency. Ward was a skilled portrait artist who had drawn members of the royal family and who had access to social events that placed him in proximity to very senior figures. Number 44. MI5, Britain's domestic intelligence service, has had a relationship with the British royal family that extends across the entire history of the agency, and while the official position is that the intelligence services operate at arm's length from the palace, the practical reality is considerably more intertwined. The security service has historically conducted monitoring of individuals considered threats to the crown and has shared intelligence about those individuals with royal household officials. Conversely, individuals connected to the palace have been the subjects of intelligence gathering, sometimes without the palace's knowledge or approval. The most discussed example is the monitoring of Diana, Princess of Wales, in the period following her separation from Charles. Multiple sources have indicated that Diana was under surveillance by various intelligence agencies in the years before her death, and the Operation Paget inquiry acknowledged that British intelligence was active in Paris at the time of the crash, though it concluded that this activity had no bearing on the accident. Number 45. The management of the British monarch's personal finances involves a degree of opacity that would be unacceptable for any other public figure in a democratic country, and that has been the subject of periodic concern from transparency advocates, tax specialists, and parliamentary committees that have never been given sufficient access to reach meaningful conclusions. The monarch's private income derives from multiple sources, including the Duchy of Lancaster, personal investments, and the revenues of a portfolio of assets accumulated across generations. The investments held through the Duchy of Lancaster alone represent a substantial and diversified portfolio whose full composition has never been publicly disclosed. When the Panama Papers were released in 2016, the documents showed that the Duchy of Lancaster had offshore investments in the Cayman Islands and Bermuda, jurisdictions that are typically used to minimize tax exposure and to maintain financial privacy. The palace acknowledged the investments, but disputed that they were improper, noting that the duchy pays all tax due in full under its specific constitutional arrangements. Number 46. The annual cost of the British monarchy to the British taxpayer is a figure that the palace and its supporters typically present in a carefully limited way, citing only the sovereign grant and comparing it favourably to the economic returns generated by royal tourism. The real cost, when examined comprehensively, is considerably larger and considerably more difficult to disaggregate from the broader public accounts. The sovereign grant for the financial year ending March 2023 was approximately £86 million, but this figure does not include the cost of policing the royal family, which is met from the Home Office budget and amounts to a figure estimated in the hundreds of millions of pounds annually. It does not include the costs of maintaining royal residences that are publicly owned, including the upkeep of Buckingham Palace, the Tower of London, Windsor Castle, and the numerous other palaces and properties across Britain that form part of the royal estate. It does not include the costs borne by local governments and police forces during royal visits or public events. Number 47. The British Royal Collection, held in trust for the nation by the monarch and described as one of the largest and most important art collections in the world, contains over 1 million objects, including paintings, drawings, furniture, ceramics, jewellery, and manuscripts accumulated across 5 centuries of royal patronage and acquisition. The question of how various items in this collection came to be in royal hands is one that has received insufficient systematic examination. The collection includes works acquired during the colonial period by officials and organizations operating under royal authority, items given as diplomatic gifts under circumstances that reflected power imbalances between the crown and the giving party, and objects whose provenance documentation is incomplete or unavailable. The Looted Art Commission and related organisations have identified items in institutional British collections whose origins in the Nazi period require investigation, and while the Royal Collection Trust has cooperated with some of these inquiries, the breadth of the provenance questions extends well beyond the Nazi period to encompass the full scope of imperial acquisition. Number 48. Princess Alice of Battenberg, the mother of Prince Philip, and great-great-granddaughter of Queen Victoria, lived one of the most extraordinary and largely unknown lives of any member of the extended royal family in the 20th century. Born deaf, she learned to lip read in multiple languages and was described by those who knew her as a woman of exceptional intelligence and courage. She was diagnosed with schizophrenia in 1930, following what her family and physicians interpreted as a religious crisis involving visions and what she described as communications from Jesus Christ. On the advice of Sigmund Freud, who was consulted by the family about her condition, she was institutionalized at a clinic near Dresden, separated from her children for an extended period. The treatment she received there included what was then described as irradiation of her ovaries, a procedure intended to eliminate her religious convictions by suppressing her sexual drive, a practice that represented the very outer edge of the medical establishment's understanding of mental illness at that time. Number 49. The Curragh Incident of 1914, sometimes called the Curragh Mutiny, was an episode in British military and political history that implicated the Crown in a crisis over Ulster and the Irish Home Rule question that has never been fully examined in terms of royal involvement. In March 1914, with Irish Home Rule legislation passing through Parliament and opposition from Ulster Unionists threatening to become armed resistance, British Army officers stationed at the Curragh camp in County Kildare indicated that they would prefer to accept dismissal rather than be ordered north to enforce Home Rule against Ulster opposition. This was effectively a threat of mutiny. The incident was resolved through a combination of political manoeuvring and a letter from the military command that was subsequently disavowed. But what made it particularly significant was the extent to which it reflected the alignment of certain sections of the British aristocracy, the military, and the Crown itself with Unionist opposition to Irish self-determination. Number 50. The British Crown's relationship with Ireland spans 8 centuries of invasion, colonisation, dispossession, and resistance that produced some of the most sustained and systematic violence of the colonial era. The plantation of Ulster in the 17th century, by which the Crown confiscated millions of acres of Irish land from their Gaelic owners and settled Protestant colonists from Britain in their place, created the demographic and religious division that has driven conflict in the north of Ireland ever since. The penal laws enacted under royal authority denied Catholic Irish people the right to own land, attend university, practice their religion publicly, or participate in the political life of their own country for generations. The Great Famine of the 1840s, during which approximately 1 million Irish people died of starvation and disease, while Ireland continued to export food to England under conditions maintained by British law, occurred during the reign of Queen Victoria, who was widely criticised at the time and afterward for the inadequacy of the official response. Number 51. The British royal family's position during the apartheid era in South Africa represented one of the most morally compromised episodes in the modern history of the institution. South Africa remained a British dominion and then a Commonwealth member state for much of the period in which apartheid was systematically entrenched as state policy, and the question of how the Crown and the Palace engaged with that system has never been addressed with transparency. Queen Elizabeth II was personally opposed to the Commonwealth imposing sanctions on South Africa during the 1980s, at a time when Margaret Thatcher's government was also resisting international pressure, though for somewhat different stated reasons. The Queen's position on Commonwealth sanctions became public through the 1986 Sunday Times report that described her concern about Thatcher's intransigence, while Thatcher herself was opposed to the sanctions. Number 52. Cecil Rhodes, the British imperialist who carved out the territories of Rhodesia in southern Africa, established the De Beers diamond monopoly and founded the Rhodes Scholarship, was a man whose ambitions for British imperial expansion were directly aligned with and supported by the British Crown in ways that are rarely foregrounded in the now controversialized discussions of his legacy. Rhodes was granted a royal charter for his British South Africa Company in 1889, giving him the legal authority of the Crown to govern, police, and exploit the territories he was aggressively colonizing. The Rhodes Scholarships, established in his will in 1902, were intended to bind the intellectual elites of the British Empire, the United States, and Germany into a pro-imperial network centered on Oxford. The values that Rhodes embodied and that the British Crown's charter empowered, the dispossession of African people from their land, the use of private military force against indigenous populations, the extraction of mineral wealth through a labor system that was coercive in everything but its formal name, were the values of British imperialism at the height of its confidence. Number 53. The Commonwealth Games, held every 4 years among nations that share the historical connection of having been part of the British Empire, present themselves as a celebration of sporting achievement and international friendship. The origins of the Games, first held in 1930 as the British Empire Games, are more explicitly colonial, a gathering of territories under British rule designed to demonstrate the unity and vitality of the imperial project at a moment when that project was already facing the first serious challenges to its legitimacy. The transformation of the name from British Empire Games to British Commonwealth Games in 1954 and then to Commonwealth Games in 1978 tracks the same kind of rebranding exercise that saw the British Empire itself gradually renamed as the Commonwealth of Nations. In each case, the substance of the relationships and the underlying power structures changed far less dramatically than the terminology suggested. The role of the British monarch as patron of the Commonwealth Games Federation, with the Games traditionally opened by either the monarch or a senior royal, remains a direct expression of the institution's enduring association with what began as an imperial project. Number 54. The health secrets of the British royal family have been managed with an intensity that goes well beyond the normal expectation of personal medical privacy, reflecting the institutional calculation that the physical vulnerability of the monarch can destabilize markets, trigger succession questions, and disturb the carefully maintained image of timeless royal continuity. Queen Victoria's physicians maintained a consistent public narrative of robustness, even as her health declined through her final years. George VI's lung cancer, caused by decades of heavy cigarette smoking, was not publicly disclosed in terms that communicated the severity of his condition until it was essentially impossible to conceal. When King Charles III was diagnosed with cancer in February 2024 and the announcement was made public, palace officials took considerable care to manage the disclosure in a way that conveyed seriousness without specifying the nature of the cancer, a level of opacity that would not be accepted from the chief executive of any publicly listed company. Number 55. The relationship between the British royal family and the press has been one of the most complex and mutually exploitative partnerships in modern media history. A relationship built on access and image management that served the interest of both parties for decades, before it fractured dramatically in the years following Diana's death. For most of the post-war period, the arrangement worked on the basis of informal agreements between palace officials and newspaper editors about what could be published, when, and with what framing. Royal correspondents who wanted continued access understood that certain stories were off-limits, that certain private behavior would not be reported, and that the palace expected advance notification when difficult stories were being prepared. In return, editors received exclusive access to official events, carefully managed photograph opportunities, and the commercial benefits of royal coverage that sold newspapers and drove circulation. Number 56. In November 1995, Diana, Princess of Wales, gave an interview to journalist Martin Bashir for the BBC's Panorama programme that was watched in Britain by an audience of over 20 million people and represented one of the most significant acts of royal defiance in the institution's modern history. Diana spoke with controlled candor about the failure of her marriage, described her struggles with depression and bulimia, disclosed that she had self-harmed, and directly challenged the palace's portrayal of her as mentally unstable. Her statement that there were three of us in this marriage, a reference to Camilla Parker Bowles, became one of the most quoted phrases in the history of broadcast journalism. The palace's immediate response was damage control, and the longer-term institutional response was a concerted effort to manage Diana's access to communications and to use her mental health disclosures against her credibility. What emerged many years later was a separate and deeply troubling dimension of the story, namely that Bashir had obtained the interview, partly by showing Diana's brother, Earl Spencer, forged bank statements suggesting that members of his own staff had been paid to spy on Diana. Number 57. The letters written by Wallis Simpson, the American divorcee for whom Edward VIII abdicated the British throne, have been the subject of academic debate and legal battles across decades, as various parties attempted either to preserve them in accessible archives or to prevent their full contents from becoming known. The correspondence that has become public contains material that the palace considered deeply uncomfortable, including letters to and from the Duke of Windsor during the years of World War II that touch on the question of German attitudes to the couple and the Duke's own feelings about the war and its potential outcomes. But the letters that generated the most persistent controversy were those relating to Wallis's relationship in the 1930s with the German ambassador Joachim von Ribbentrop, who later became Hitler's foreign minister. Multiple sources, including figures who claimed first-hand knowledge of the correspondence, have alleged that the relationship between Wallis and Ribbentrop was intimate, and that the letters documenting it were purchased by the British government and destroyed rather than preserved. Number 58. The Act of Settlement of 1701 is the piece of legislation that governs the succession to the British throne and determines who may or may not become the sovereign, and its provisions reflect the religious and political anxieties of an era that are deeply at odds with the values of a modern democratic state. The Act bars any Roman Catholic from succeeding to the throne, and until its partial amendment in 2013, also barred anyone who married a Roman Catholic. The 2013 Succession to the Crown Act addressed the most obviously anachronistic elements, removing the prohibition on heirs marrying Catholics and ending the principle of male primogeniture, by which sons took precedence over daughters, regardless of birth order. But the fundamental prohibition on a Catholic monarch remains in place, enshrined in law in a way that explicitly discriminates on grounds of religion, and the formal role of the monarch as supreme governor of the Church of England means that any change would require fundamental renegotiation of the relationship between the state, the church, and the crown. Number 59. The British royal family's connections to pharmaceutical and healthcare industries have rarely been examined as a formal subject of investigation. But the intersection of royal patronages, charitable foundations, and corporate interests in the healthcare sector creates a web of relationships whose potential for conflict of interests has received very little scrutiny. Prince Charles, during his years as Prince of Wales, was a prominent advocate for alternative and complementary medicine, and he used both his public platform and his direct access to government ministers through the Black Spider Memo correspondence to advance the cause of homeopathy and other treatments that the mainstream medical establishment considers ineffective and in some cases potentially harmful. His advocacy included direct lobbying for the continued availability of homeopathic treatments on the National Health Service, a position that placed him in direct opposition to the evidence-based medicine consensus. The Royal Homeopathic Hospital in London, of which he was a patron, received public funding in part because of his active institutional support. Number 60. The rules governing succession to the British throne, while apparently straightforward in their basic outline, involve constitutional complexities and historical anomalies that have never been subject to democratic reform in the countries that share the British monarch as their head of state. The 2013 Succession to the Crown Act resolved some of the most obviously anachronistic provisions, but the fundamental principle that the succession is determined entirely by parliamentary legislation in one country, Britain, with no input from the other 15 realms that share the same monarch, remains a constitutional absurdity that is almost never discussed publicly. When the succession passes, as it will, through the current generation of royals, the precise ordering of precedence among the children and grandchildren of King Charles III involves legal questions that have been modified by recent legislation but remain imperfectly rationalized. Number 61. King George VI, who unexpectedly became king in December 1936, following his brother Edward VIII's abdication, is typically portrayed in popular history as a figure of quiet courage and steadfast duty who overcame a severe stutter to serve his people through the ordeal of the Second World War. The fuller picture of his life is one of a man who was temperamentally unsuited to the role thrust upon him, who struggled with anxiety and depression throughout his reign, and whose physical health was severely damaged by the cigarette smoking that ultimately contributed to his death from lung cancer at the age of 56. George's stutter, which was addressed through the work of speech therapist Lionel Logue in a relationship portrayed in the film The King's Speech, was managed well enough in public by the time of the war years, but it represented a visible and persistent challenge that the palace worked consistently to minimize in its communications. What was less publicly acknowledged was the extent to which George's anxiety extended beyond his stammer to encompass a broader psychological fragility that made the demands of the wartime kingship genuinely taxing in ways that went beyond the physical. Number 62. The British monarch possesses a set of constitutional powers, known collectively as the royal prerogative, that are exercised either personally by the sovereign or, more commonly, by ministers of the crown acting in the sovereign's name. And these powers remain largely outside the scope of parliamentary oversight or democratic accountability in ways that would be considered extraordinary if they were examined directly. The royal prerogative includes the powers to declare war, to make and ratify treaties, to issue and revoke passports, to grant pardons, to award honours and peerages, to appoint and dismiss the Prime Minister, and to dissolve Parliament. Most of these powers are exercised on the advice of ministers and are therefore subject to democratic accountability indirectly. But several retain elements of personal royal discretion whose boundaries have never been tested in court. The power to appoint a prime minister in circumstances of constitutional uncertainty, as arose in the 2010 British general election, and to dismiss one, as occurred in Australia in 1975, are among the most significant prerogative powers and the ones whose exercise can have the most direct impact on democratic governance. Number 63. The departure of Prince Harry and Meghan, Duchess of Sussex, from their roles as senior working members of the royal family in January 2020, their subsequent move to California, and their decision to give a series of interviews and eventually a Netflix documentary series in which they described their experiences within the institution, represented the most significant public rupture in the British royal family's modern history. The palace's official position on the events described by Harry and Meghan has been consistently one of private differences being better resolved in private, a formula that allowed the institution to dispute specifics without engaging with the substance of the concerns raised. Harry and Meghan described a pattern of institutional racism in the treatment of Meghan by the press and by elements of the palace, a lack of support when Meghan expressed suicidal ideation, concerns about the skin color of their unborn child raised by an unnamed member of the family, and systematic briefing against them to the media by palace officials while they were denied institutional support and communications assistance. The palace's denials of these specific claims were careful and limited. Number 64. The British royal family's treatment of Meghan Markle, before and after her marriage to Prince Harry in May 2018, became the subject of intense public debate, partly because it was so visibly different from the treatment received by other women who had married into the family, and because the pattern of that difference mapped onto race and cultural background in ways that the palace was unwilling to acknowledge. From the earliest days of their relationship, Harry and Meghan received a volume and intensity of hostile media coverage that was qualitatively different from what other royals had experienced at equivalent stages of their relationships. The coverage included racist tropes, comparisons that would not have been made about white members of the family, and a consistent framing of Meghan as an outsider and a problematic element within the institution. Palace officials briefed journalists against Harry and Meghan, while the couple was prevented from having their own communications team that could respond to inaccurate stories. When Meghan sought institutional support for her mental health after disclosing suicidal thoughts, she was told this would create negative press. Number 65. Princesses Beatrice and Eugenie, the daughters of Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson, have occupied one of the more uncomfortable positions within the modern royal family, caught between the demands and expectations of royal life and the reputational damage caused by both of their parents in different ways and at different times. Sarah Ferguson, who separated from Prince Andrew in 1992 and divorced him in 1996, sold access to the Duke in a sting operation in 2010, during which she was filmed accepting cash and promising to arrange meetings with her former husband in exchange for payment. The subsequent scandal forced Andrew to distance himself publicly from his former wife, though the two have maintained a private relationship and have lived at times in considerable proximity. The consequences for Beatrice and Eugenie of growing up with parents whose public behavior repeatedly generated controversy, and of navigating royal life without the full institutional support and protection extended to their cousins in the direct line of succession, have been substantial. Number 66. One of the most quietly dramatic relationships in the later life of Queen Victoria was her connection with her Indian servant Abdul Karim, a young man from Agra who arrived at Windsor in 1887 as part of her Golden Jubilee celebrations, and who became, within a relatively short time, one of her most trusted confidants. Victoria was captivated by Abdul, as she called him, taught herself Urdu with his assistance, appointed him her munshi or teacher, and elevated him to a position of remarkable personal intimacy that scandalized her household and generated intense resentment among both her personal staff and members of her family. The court's objections to Abdul operated on multiple levels simultaneously, combining anxiety about a young Indian man's influence over the Queen with explicit racism that Victoria herself found objectionable, class consciousness about the elevation of a servant to the Queen's table and her private councils, and political concern about what Abdul might be communicating to contacts in India about palace affairs. Number 67. The British royal family's relationship with the partition of India in August 1947 represents one of the most significant and most contested moments in the Crown's modern history. The partition, which divided the subcontinent into the independent states of India and Pakistan along religious lines, was executed under Lord Mountbatten, serving as the last Viceroy of India and the King's personal representative, and it was carried out with a speed that most historians now regard as catastrophically irresponsible. The Boundary Commission, tasked with drawing the new international border between India and Pakistan, was given only 5 weeks to complete its work, and the lines it drew cut through communities, agricultural systems, and transport networks in ways that made mass violence almost inevitable. Between 1 and 2 million people died in the communal violence that followed partition, and between 10 and 20 million people were displaced in the largest forced migration in human history. Mountbatten, operating with the full authority and imprimatur of the Crown, made decisions about the timing and process of partition that multiplied the human cost of an already enormously difficult transition. Number 68. In November 1992, a fire broke out in the Queen's private chapel at Windsor Castle that burned for 15 hours and damaged 100 rooms across 9 main areas of the castle, destroying a significant portion of one of the most historically important royal residences in Britain. The fire began when a spotlight ignited a curtain near the chapel's altar and spread rapidly through the poorly compartmentalized Victorian-era roof space. The initial government response, announced by Heritage Secretary Peter Brook, was that the cost of restoration, subsequently estimated at £37 million, would be met entirely by the public purse. The announcement was met with considerable public anger, concentrated on the observation that the castle was not insured and that the Queen had not been paying income tax since 1936, a practice that was itself a matter of ongoing private debate. Within days, faced with the strength of public feeling, the Queen announced that she would pay income tax voluntarily from 1993 and would open Buckingham Palace to paying visitors to raise funds toward the restoration cost. Number 69. Balmoral Castle in the Scottish Highlands, purchased by Queen Victoria and Prince Albert in 1852 and extended by Albert into the turreted Scottish baronial structure that stands today, functions as the royal family's private summer retreat and as something of an institutional black box about which relatively little verifiable information ever emerges. The castle and the surrounding Balmoral estate, covering approximately 50,000 acres of Deeside countryside, are private property of the sovereign, outside the framework of publicly held royal palaces, and the activities conducted there are not subject to the same degree of institutional oversight and press access as events at Buckingham Palace or Kensington Palace. Balmoral's significance extends beyond its function as a holiday destination. It was at Balmoral that Queen Victoria received much of the political education and private counsel that shaped her views on governance, at a distance from the formal court and ministerial structures of London. Number 70. The British royal family's financial relationships with the oil and gas industry represent one of the least examined intersections of royal wealth and the extractive industries that have shaped both global inequality and the environmental crisis of the current era. The Crown Estate, whose revenues provide the basis for the sovereign grant paid to the monarch, holds significant assets, including the rights to the seabed around Britain's coastline, through which licensing revenues from offshore oil and gas development flow. The Duchy of Lancaster's investment portfolio has at various times included holdings in companies with substantial fossil fuel operations. Prince Charles's environmental advocacy during his years as Prince of Wales, which was genuine in many of its expressions, existed in complicated tension with the financial interests of the institution he represented and ultimately inherited. His campaigns for sustainable agriculture and forest protection were conducted by a man whose institutional inheritance included a property portfolio and investment structure, with significant exposure to the extractive industries he publicly criticized. Number 71. Every major monarchy maintains a protocol for managing the death of its sovereign, and the British royal family's arrangements, known under the code name Operation London Bridge for Queen Elizabeth II and Operation Menai Bridge for the Prince of Wales, represent decades of planning for the management of what the palace understands to be not merely a family bereavement, but a major state and communications event. Operation London Bridge, which was activated on September 8, 2022, following the death of Queen Elizabeth II at Balmoral, involved the coordinated deployment of pre-prepared communications, pre-drafted news scripts, held by broadcasters in readiness for immediate transmission, pre-arranged ceremonial procedures covering every hour of the 10-day mourning period, and the activation of multiple government departments in a choreographed response that had been rehearsed across several years. The existence of such planning is not in itself remarkable for an institution that operates within well-understood ceremonial traditions. Number 72. In the weeks following Queen Elizabeth II's death in September 2022, Operation London Bridge revealed aspects of the palace's organisational machinery that had rarely been publicly visible. The operation was the culmination of planning that had begun in earnest in the 1960s and been updated continuously since, with government departments, the BBC and other broadcasters, the military, and the police all having their own parallel operations activated simultaneously. The BBC had prepared obituary footage for senior royals that had been updated regularly and held in secure storage for immediate broadcast. Senior presenters maintained dark formal clothes in their offices at all times in case the call came during working hours. Government press offices had drafted statements that required only the insertion of a date and cause of death. The scale of this preparation illuminated the degree to which the continuity of the monarchy is treated as a matter of state rather than a private family concern, and the resources invested in ensuring the smooth management of the transition pointed to an institutional anxiety about what might happen if the mourning period were not perfectly controlled. Number 73. The coronation of King Charles III on May 6, 2023, was the first British coronation in 70 years and was presented as a modernised ceremony that had been thoughtfully revised to reflect the diversity of contemporary British and Commonwealth society. In practice, the ceremony retained the core of its medieval architecture, including the anointing, the investiture, and the homage, while making careful amendments at the edges that could be described as inclusive, without disturbing the fundamental structure of a ceremony whose symbolism is deeply rooted in a vision of British Christian kingship. The invitation extended to faith leaders from non-Christian traditions. The inclusion of a moment in the ceremony, inviting the public to make their own affirmation of loyalty, rather than being represented solely by peers, and the use of diverse musical and choral contributions were all presented as evidence of meaningful modernization. Number 74. King Charles III's decades-long advocacy for environmental causes, sustainable agriculture, and action on climate change is one of the most genuine expressions of personal conviction in the modern history of the British royal family, and his influence on public debate about these issues over 40 years has been substantial. The tension between his personal convictions and the institutional and financial interests he represents, however, has never been fully resolved or even directly addressed. As Prince of Wales, Charles advocated passionately for reduced carbon emissions while travelling extensively by private jet and helicopter for official engagements, a contradiction that was repeatedly noted by environmental journalists. The Duchy of Cornwall estate, which he managed with considerable personal attention during his years as Prince of Wales, included genuinely progressive organic farming operations at his Highgrove estate, but also encompassed conventional agricultural practices across much of the duchy's broader holdings. Number 75. The Duchy of Lancaster is one of the most unusual financial structures in the British constitutional system, a private hereditary estate owned personally by the monarch, generating substantial annual income and shielded from the normal requirements of corporate transparency and tax accountability that apply to every other comparable enterprise in Britain. The estate encompasses approximately 18,000 acres of land in Lancashire, Cheshire, and Yorkshire, along with urban properties in London and various other commercial and financial assets, and its annual profits, running to tens of millions of pounds, pass directly to the monarch, free of corporation tax under the constitutional arrangements governing the duchy's unique status. The duchy dates to 1265, and its special constitutional position reflects legal arrangements that have never been reformed to reflect the transformation of Britain from a medieval monarchy to a modern democratic state. Parliamentary committees examining the royal family's finances have repeatedly noted the opacity of the duchy's investment portfolio and the absence of any requirement for independent public audit. Number 76. The celebrations surrounding Queen Elizabeth II's Platinum Jubilee in June 2022, marking her 70 years on the throne, were organised at enormous public expense and presented as a unifying national celebration. The public presentation, however, concealed a number of controversies that received less prominent coverage than the pageantry surrounding the events themselves. The announcement that the 96-year-old Queen would participate in a trooping ceremony at the Horse Guards Parade was subsequently modified when it became clear that her mobility limitations would prevent it, a change that was managed in a way that obscured the extent of her physical decline from public view. The absence of Prince Harry and Meghan from the prominent ceremonial positions they had occupied at previous public events reflected an institutional decision to limit their visibility during the Jubilee, even as the palace maintained publicly that they were welcome family members. Number 77. When Princess Elizabeth married Lieutenant Philip Mountbatten in November 1947, the question of what title her husband should bear became a matter of considerable constitutional complexity and personal sensitivity. Under the existing conventions, the husband of a queen, regnant, did not automatically receive the title of king, as the title carried with it implications of sovereignty and power that the constitutional arrangements surrounding a queen, regnant, were not designed to accommodate. George VI's letters patent granted Philip the title of Prince of the United Kingdom, but the title of Prince Consort, which had been held by Queen Victoria's husband Albert, was not automatically attached, and it was not until 1957 that Elizabeth issued new letters, patent creating Philip a Prince of the United Kingdom in his own right. Throughout his 65 years as the Queen's husband, Philip never held the title of King Consort, a decision that many who knew him believed he found personally difficult. Number 78. Princess Diana's charitable work, conducted throughout her marriage and with increasing independence in the years following her separation from Charles, was substantially more significant and more personally engaged than the palace's management of it suggested at the time. Diana used her public platform to draw attention to AIDS at a moment when the disease was still subject to the kind of social stigma that discouraged physical contact with those who had the condition, and her willingness to touch and embrace AIDS patients in a manner that was entirely normal. Human warmth, but was radical in its public symbolism, helped shift public attitudes in a way that formal government campaigns had not managed. Her involvement with the international campaign against landmines in the final years of her life generated significant controversy in the British establishment because it was explicitly political in a way that royal charitable engagement was not supposed to be, and she faced pressure from senior ministers to stay out of what they characterized as a complex foreign policy area. Number 79. The intersection of the British royal family with Freemasonry is considerably deeper than public acknowledgement typically suggests, and the way that intersection has operated in practice raises questions that neither institution has been willing to answer directly. Beyond the formal membership of specific royals in the United Grand Lodge of England, the informal alignment between the two institutions in terms of their shared membership, their shared commitment to secrecy and discretion, and their overlapping networks of influence in British professional and public life represents a structural relationship whose practical consequences have rarely been examined. Critics have argued for decades that Masonic networks within the British police, judiciary, and civil service have been used to suppress investigations and protect individuals whose conduct would otherwise have resulted in criminal prosecution, and that the proximity of senior royals to these networks has provided an additional layer of protection to individuals who might otherwise have faced accountability. Number 80. The education of British royal children has historically been conducted within a framework of assumptions about class, privilege, and the appropriate preparation for public life that reflects the institution's broader values more clearly than almost any other aspect of royal life. Until relatively recently, royals were educated primarily by private tutors within the palace, a system that isolated them from ordinary social experience in ways that many observers believed contributed to the significant disconnection between the royal family's understanding of British life and the reality of that life for most of the population. The decision to send Prince Charles to Gordonstoun School in Scotland, a choice made partly on the basis of Prince Philip's own experience there, was in retrospect widely considered to have been poor, as Charles found the school's ethos deeply uncongenial, and the experience contributed to feelings of isolation and inadequacy that he has described in various contexts over the years. Number 81. The British royal family's relationship with the Pembroke and Cardigan Welsh corgis that Queen Elizabeth II kept throughout the vast majority of her reign has been treated as a charming personal eccentricity and a reliable source of warmly favourable press coverage across more than 80 years of public life. But the corgis represented something more than a personal preference in the institutional life of the palace. They functioned as a consistent and carefully managed element of the Queen's public image, their presence in photographs and official portraits, providing a visual signal of domesticity, approachability, and personal warmth that was particularly valuable for an institution that was otherwise somewhat remote and formal in its public presentation. The dogs were managed as a communications asset as deliberately as any other element of the royal image, and the coverage devoted to them in the British and international press was understood by palace communications staff as serving a specific and useful function in maintaining public affection for the Queen at moments when the broader institutional news was less favourable. Number 82. The correspondence between the British royal palace and the Australian government, including communications related to the appointment and removal of Governors-General and the management of sensitive constitutional matters, represents a category of diplomatic exchange that has been subject to remarkable levels of official protection. The palace correspondence released in 2020, following historian Jenny Hocking's long legal battle with the Australian National Archives, opened one specific window onto the nature of the communication between Kerr and the palace in 1975, but it represented only a portion of the relevant archive. The Queen's correspondence with Australian Governors-General and Prime Ministers across the full span of her reign remains substantially inaccessible, held in the Royal Archives at Windsor under the same exemptions from freedom of information that shield the palace's other private records. Number 83. The convention that members of the British royal family do not vote in elections, while not an absolute legal prohibition, is one of the most firmly maintained aspects of the institution's commitment to its publicly stated position of political neutrality. The reasoning is straightforward at its surface level. A monarch who votes openly for a political party would be seen to be expressing a personal political preference that could influence the outcome and would compromise the constitutional position of the sovereign as the head of state, representing all citizens, regardless of their political affiliation. The practical implication of this convention is that the monarch and other senior members of the family effectively disenfranchise themselves as a condition of occupying their positions. But the surface commitment to political neutrality masks a much more complicated reality in which the royal family exercises political influence through multiple channels while publicly maintaining the fiction of non-engagement. Number 84. Trooping the colour, the annual ceremony in which the regimental colour is paraded before the sovereign to mark the monarch's official birthday, has been performed with remarkable consistency since the early 18th century and represents one of the most spectacular pieces of military pageantry in the world. What the elaborate ceremony, with its thousands of soldiers and horses moving through choreographed formations on Horse Guards Parade, represents in terms of power and historical meaning is something that its very perfection tends to obscure. The ceremony originated as a practical military function, the trooping of the regiment's colours before the troops, so that they could recognise the flag they were to rally to in the confusion of battle. It became a ceremonial event during the reign of George II, and its survival and elaboration across nearly 3 centuries reflects the British establishment's extraordinary commitment to the maintenance of visible symbols of monarchical continuity. The annual spectacle is enormously expensive, requiring months of preparation, rehearsal, and the direct participation of thousands of soldiers in active service who might otherwise be deployed operationally. Number 85. The British Crown's role in the broader networks of colonial extraction that characterize the administration of the British Empire represents one of the most significant and least examined dimensions of the institution's historical legacy. The structures through which wealth moved from colonized territories to Britain, the legal frameworks that authorize the dispossession of indigenous people from their land, the labor systems that ranged from outright enslavement to conditions of coercion that fell just short of legal slavery, and the military machinery that enforced compliance with these arrangements were all operated in the name of the Crown and authorized by royal charters, royal commissions, and the full weight of the Crown's legal authority. In Australia, this meant the convict transportation system, through which Britain used the continent as a dumping ground for its own surplus population from 1788 onward. The frontier violence through which Aboriginal people were killed, displaced, and confined as their lands were taken for pastoral use, and the legislative frameworks through which Aboriginal Australians were denied basic rights that were extended to the immigrant population. Number 86. Queen Victoria's relationship with death and mourning reached a depth of obsession that went well beyond the most intense expressions of Victorian grief culture, and that shaped the final 40 years of her reign in ways that her court and her family found increasingly difficult to manage. Following Prince Albert's death on December the 14th, 1861, Victoria entered a period of mourning that was never fully lifted. She wore black for the remainder of her life, a period of nearly 40 years. She required that Albert's clothing be laid out each morning as if he were still present, and that hot water be brought to his rooms for washing. She slept with a cast of his hand beside her and communicated with his spirit through a medium. Every night, the evening clothes Albert had worn to dinner were laid out by his valet on the bed. His shaving kit was set out each morning for a man who had been dead for decades. She refused for years to conduct the business of monarchy in any manner that required her to appear publicly, a withdrawal from public duties that generated considerable popular resentment and periodic calls for her removal. Number 87. Prince William's early life was shaped by experiences that would have been extraordinary in any family, but that carried a particular weight within the institutional context of the British monarchy. He was born second in line to the throne, a position carrying immense future responsibility, to parents whose marriage was publicly collapsing before his childhood was over. He was 12 years old when his parents' separation was formally announced, and 15 years old when his mother died. The palace's management of William and Harry's exposure to the worst moments of their parents' public conflict reflected an institutional tension between the need to protect them as children and the imperative to manage the institution's communications during one of its most damaging periods. William has spoken in various contexts about the difficulty of grieving his mother's death, while simultaneously being expected to maintain public composure as a member of an institution that was itself being blamed by significant sections of the public for contributing to her death. Number 88. The story of Catherine, Princess of Wales, and her path from the daughter of a self-made businessman to the future Queen Consort has been presented in the official narrative as a modern love story without precedent in royal history. The reality of how that path was navigated and what the institution's role in enabling and shaping it was is somewhat more complicated. Catherine met Prince William at the University of St Andrews in Scotland in 2001, and they began a relationship that developed through his years at Sandringham House and in the military. What the official account rarely emphasizes is the degree to which Catherine and her family managed the relationship with a strategic patience that the palace itself eventually came to recognize as the model for managing a relationship with a senior royal. The couple's relationship broke off in 2007, with William reportedly struggling with the public implications of commitment, and Catherine's response to maintain composure, to avoid public statements, and to wait was precisely the kind of institutional performance the palace most valued. Number 89. The genetic connection between the British royal family and the Romanovs, whose imperial dynasty ended with the execution of Tsar Nicholas II and his family in 1918, was confirmed by DNA analysis in the 1990s as part of the process of identifying the remains found near Yekaterinburg. The analysis used DNA samples from living members of the British royal family, including Prince Philip, who was a grandnephew of Tsarina Alexandra, to confirm the identity of the skeletal remains. The DNA comparison confirmed that the remains were those of the Romanov family with a high degree of scientific certainty, effectively closing one chapter of one of the most debated mysteries of 20th century history. What the analysis also confirmed, by implication, was the remarkably close genetic relationship between the European royal houses that had intermarried extensively throughout the 19th century. Queen Victoria, who lived until 1901, was the grandmother or great-grandmother of most of the monarchs, who sat on European thrones at the outbreak of World War I, a war that would kill many millions of people fighting to protect the interest of rulers who were, in many cases, close blood relatives. Number 90. The financing of royal weddings represents one of the less transparent dimensions of the relationship between the Crown and the British taxpayer, with costs distributed across multiple funding streams in ways that make the total figure very difficult to establish independently. The wedding of Prince Charles and Lady Diana Spencer in July 1981 was funded through a combination of the Civil List, the Department of the Environment, the Metropolitan Police, and various other government budgets, with the total cost estimated at the time at between several £100,000 and several £1,000,000, depending on what was included in the calculation. The wedding of Prince William and Catherine Middleton in April 2011 generated considerable public debate about costs, with police protection alone estimated at several £1,000,000. The palace's standard response to questions about cost emphasizes the economic return from tourism and the commercial value of the global media coverage, arguments that are difficult to verify independently and that do not address the equity question of whether public money should be spent on private family events, regardless of their entertainment value to a watching world. Number 91. Princess Michael of Kent, the wife of the Queen's cousin, Prince Michael, has occupied one of the most contested positions in the modern royal family, a figure whose combination of high social ambition and repeated controversial public statements made her one of the most reliably uncomfortable members of an institution that generally prefers its periphery to remain quiet. Born Marie Christine von Reibnitz in Bohemia in 1945, she married Prince Michael in 1978 and received the courtesy title Princess Michael of Kent. Her background, including the revelation that her father had been a member of the SS, generated substantial adverse publicity, and her response to that revelation was considered by many to have been inadequate. She was privately described by one member of the royal family in terms that became public as rather grand for royals, a characterization she was aware of and appeared to regard with relative equanimity. Her public statements over the years included comments about race that were described as racist by those who heard or reported them, including an incident at a New York restaurant in 2004, where she was alleged to have told a table of black diners to go back to the colonies. Number 92. The relationship between the British royal family and the international arms trade represents one of the most sensitive and least examined dimensions of the Crown's role in British foreign policy. The monarch is the formal head of state of the country that is one of the world's largest exporters of military equipment, and the relationship between royal visits, royal patronages of defence contractors, and the promotion of British arms sales abroad has never been subjected to independent ethical scrutiny. The tradition of royal family members using state visits and official trips to support British commercial interests, including defence equipment sales, has a long history. The question of whether and how senior royals have been briefed about specific arms deals before official visits to customer nations, and whether the implicit endorsement of a royal visit forms part of the commercial relationship being cultivated, has been raised by arms control campaigners and parliamentary committees, but has never been answered with transparency by either the palace or the relevant government departments. Number 93. The future of the British monarchy is the subject of polling in Britain and across the Commonwealth that shows consistent generational patterns of declining support, with younger people in most countries significantly less likely than older people to express support for maintaining the constitutional monarchy as the form of government. In Australia, polling has consistently shown that a substantial plurality and often a majority of respondents, particularly in younger age groups, favour moving to a republic, and the question has never been far from the surface of Australian political conversation since the failed Republic referendum of 1999. That referendum, in which 55% of Australians voted against a specific Republican model, rather than against the principle of a republic, was interpreted by monarchists as a decisive endorsement of the constitutional status quo, and by Republicans as evidence that the right model had not yet been found, rather than that the desire for change was absent. Number 94. The legal and constitutional significance of royal titles extends well beyond their ceremonial function and into areas of practical governance and legal authority that are rarely explained to the public in the countries affected by them. The title of Duke of Cornwall, for example, which is held by the heir apparent to the British throne, carries with it not only the revenues of the duchy, but also specific legal powers relating to the administration of that estate that are exercised personally by the title holder without reference to democratic institutions. The title of Prince of Wales, which has been conferred on the heir to the throne, since Edward I granted it to his son in 1301, following the conquest of Wales, carries historical resonances of colonial subjugation that have never ceased to be felt in Wales, and that periodic discussions of Welsh independence have brought back to particular prominence. In the Australian context, the Governor-General, acting in the name of the Crown, exercises powers derived from titles and constitutional positions whose legal substance has rarely been examined by the people they affect. Number 95. The British Crown's relationship with the colonisation of Australia is the foundational context within which every other aspect of the Crown's ongoing role in Australian life must be understood. The decision to establish a penal colony at Botany Bay in 1788, made in the name of King George III, initiated a process of colonial settlement that dispossessed the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people of their land, their sovereignty, their cultural practices, and in many cases their lives, over the following century and a half. The legal doctrine that authorised this dispossession, terra nullius, the claim that Australia was legally empty of prior ownership, was declared in the name of the Crown and was used to justify the complete absence of any treaty with Aboriginal people, of the kind that was entered into with the Maori in New Zealand through the Treaty of Waitangi in 1840. Number 96. The British Raj, the period of direct crown rule over the Indian subcontinent from 1858, following the abolition of the East India Company in the wake of the 1857 uprising, until Indian independence in 1947, represents one of the most extensive and consequential episodes in the history of the British Crown's colonial power. During those 89 years, India was governed in the name of the British monarch, with the title Empress of India created specifically for Queen Victoria in 1876. The extraction of wealth from India during the Raj period has been the subject of detailed economic analysis by historians, including Utsa Patnaik, who estimated the net drain of wealth from India to Britain during the colonial period at figures reaching into the trillions of dollars in contemporary values. The famines that killed millions of Indians during the Raj period, including the Great Bengal Famine of 1943, in which estimates of deaths range from 2 to 3 million people, occurred under British Crown administration, with evidence that colonial food export policies contributed directly to the scale of mortality. Number 97. The British monarch's constitutional role as Supreme Governor of the Church of England creates a set of religious obligations and institutional commitments that sit in increasingly obvious tension with the religious diversity of the contemporary population, not only in Britain, but across the 15 realms for which the monarch serves as head of state. As Supreme Governor, the monarch appoints Church of England, bishops and archbishops on the advice of the Prime Minister, formally approves changes to Church of England doctrine and liturgy, and is required at the coronation to swear to maintain the Protestant Reformed religion established by law. This specifically Protestant Christian constitutional commitment sits awkwardly in a country where Christianity is now practiced by a minority of the population, and even more awkwardly in Australia, New Zealand, and the other realms where the constitutional head of state is the head of a specific Christian denomination that represents only one element of the religious diversity of those societies. Number 98. The final months and days of Queen Elizabeth II's life were managed with the same combination of institutional discretion and strategic communication that had characterized the palace's approach to every sensitive matter throughout her reign. As her health declined visibly in 2021 and 2022, palace communications carefully calibrated the language used to describe her condition, using formulations like episodic mobility problems and discomfort that implied a temporary management challenge rather than the systemic physical decline of a woman in her mid-90s. The decision to appoint Liz Truss as Prime Minister on September 6, 2022, just 2 days before the Queen's death at Balmoral Castle rather than in the customary setting of Buckingham Palace, was itself an indication of how significantly her mobility had been compromised, though palace communications described the choice of Balmoral as reflecting Her Majesty's preference and her comfort rather than her incapacity. The public was not told, and had no way of knowing, that the woman receiving the new Prime Minister was a person whose doctors were already very concerned about her condition. Number 99. The British monarchy continues to exist in the 21st century, not primarily because of any coherent democratic decision to retain it, but because of a combination of constitutional inertia, institutional self-preservation, and a managed public narrative that has consistently succeeded in associating the Crown with values of stability, continuity, and national identity, that alternatives are presented as threatening. The institution has survived scandals that would have destroyed any elected government, weathered crises of public confidence that reached points of genuine existential threat, and successfully navigated the transformation from the imperial sovereignty of the Victorian era to the constitutional monarchy of the contemporary period, all without ever submitting its existence to a genuine democratic test. And that, quietly, is where we leave our story tonight. From Victoria's hidden grief to the unanswered questions still surrounding the 1975 dismissal, the British royal family has carried more than its share of buried truths. The palaces look magnificent from the outside, and perhaps they always will. Thank you for spending this time here with these stories. Sleep well, wherever in the world you are watching from.